Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the next installment of the Muskingum County Social Justice Coalition Community Education Series. We embarked on this endeavor a few months ago with the goal of sharing some information about various issues surrounding race and culture and some other related issues. We've gotten off to a very good start. I think we've had good participation, good discussion, and I see us on the continuum that we hope to provide. And so we just want you to listen and learn, and certainly when the opportunity is there to engage with our presenter for the evening in a lively discussion. And hopefully we'll take away some things that that you can use not only for yourself, but in your community or in your workplace or wherever you interact with other people in your sphere of influence and wherever you work and live. So again, welcome, and for some of you, welcome back. It's good to see your faces. So we've had 3 sessions. Well, this will be our 3rd session. Our first session was what is culture. The second one was cultural relativism, and tonight our presenter is going to talk about paradoxes of culture. So if you see the theme there, we're really trying to dig into culture and all things surrounding that as a way of kind of building up to what we want to accomplish towards the end of this is folks who participate regularly have a better understanding of culture and some of the surrounding issues and how it impacts how we behave, how we think, and ultimately how we interact in the community. So our presenter tonight, as has been the case so far, that we promised at the beginning of this series, someone who's local, who has a vested interest in what happens in Muskingum County and in and around Zanesville. We promised that most of our speakers would fall in that category. So our presenter for the evening is Dr. Allison Gunter. Dr. Gunter is an assistant professor of education at Muskingum University. She's done quite a bit of work with children and families and around the things, some of the issues that they are confronted with and work with. And so without any more from me, I'm going to ask Dr. Gunter to go ahead and begin. And after, we'll have an opportunity to do some questions and answers. So, Dr. Gunter.
Thank you, Daryl, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. As Daryl stated, my name is Dr. Allison Gunter, and I am here this evening to talk to you a little bit about, or I should say talk with you a little about the paradoxes of culture, because I don't like to just talk to people. I like to engage in conversation with others because we all have different perspectives and viewpoints, and I'm a teacher as well as a learner. So our discussion tonight will be collaborative and I hope engaging for everyone. So as we engage in this discussion this evening around the paradoxes of culture, I want us to really focus our attention on how we're listening to learn and how we're learning to listen. Before we jump into the meat of this discussion and begin really diving into a critical understanding of culture, I want us to take a moment and ponder these 2 statements. Well, one question and one statement. What is culture, and culturally I identify as? So if you look in the chat, you will see a link to the Jamboard. I want you to click on the link that is now posted in the chat and go to the Jamboard. Take a moment. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to define culture in your own words. So what is culture to you? And I also want you to share culturally how you identify. And should you run out of space for Post-its on the first board, just click the arrow at the top of the Jamboard and it will take you to the second page. So again, we're going to take about 2 minutes, and I want each of you to post, how do you conceptualize this word culture, and culturally, how do you identify? All right, I see a lot of definitions for culture and culturally how people identify. So for those of you who aren't finished, that's perfectly fine. You can continue typing your Post-its into the Jamboard. But we're going to move on. However, I want you to keep your Jamboard in close proximity to you. So be able to find that tab again later on, because we're going to come back and revisit this information later on in our discussion this evening. So as Daryl stated, tonight we're talking about the paradoxes of culture. So this evening, we're here to discuss our concept of culture and examine the impact this construct has on cross-cultural engagement. And we're looking at it from the perspective of learning styles, viewing it through an intersectional frame. And when I say an intersectional frame, I'm referring to the different ways in which we identify or speak of ourselves or connect with others. And the reason why we're having this discussion is because we hope that it leads to open communication and understanding of differences, right? So in order for us to be able to engage effectively and understand each other and have civil discourse, we need to understand who we are and where we come from. So that's why culture and the paradoxes of culture this evening. So starting out, everyone has culture. So get it out of your mind that because you are of a certain race or place or space that you don't have a culture. Everybody has culture. And it's so funny, as I was reading your comments on the Jamboard, I noticed that one person actually stated that they did not have culture. So you do, you actually have culture. And the reason why I started you all with thinking about what culture is I wanted to see how you thought about this construct of culture. Basically get your background knowledge on it. Here on this slide, what I have posed to you are two different somewhat definitions of culture. The first one being by the anthropologist Margaret Mead, where she shares she shares culture from the perspective of the whole. So looking at it from not only a societal perspective, but looking at it as it pertains to race and how we engage in these different groups within culture. And she explains culture from the perspective of us having an understanding that is about tradition, it's about behavior, it's about what is passed down from generation to generation, our religion, our beliefs. And one thing that she points out in her definition of culture is that it's less precise. And I want you to think about that, you know, how culture is less precise, because that's critical when we continue this conversation and we're talking about the paradoxes of culture. In addition to the definition of culture from Margaret Mead, I also wanted to share the definition of culture from Dr. Anita Jackson, who, similar to Margaret Mead, defines culture as cumulative. And her definition actually aligns with what many of you stated on the Jamboard when you were defining culture. That culture is cumulative. It is a deposit of knowledge, experiences, our traditions, our beliefs, our attitudes, how we engage with others. For me, I define culture as how do we move about these spaces? What are those experiences that inform our worldview? To me, culture is ever changing because, like one person said, we move around. Well, some of us move around a lot anyway. So while traditionally, or we think about it from a generational perspective, we have that culture within our families that is embedded with us. But as we grow and learn and navigate different spaces throughout this journey we call life, our cultures change somewhat. So as you're reading these definitions and processing your own definition of culture, I want you to remember that everyone has culture. Now, to continue to build on that theme of everyone has culture and the reason we're discussing what we're discussing tonight, this is an image of Dr. Florida Lasson Phillips. And the reason why I embedded her in this presentation is because while the focus is on the paradoxes of culture and how we conceptualize this construct and use it for communicating and understanding each other, um, the work of Dr. Ladson Billings also informs this talk this evening. Um, she is an educator. She's an educational anthropologist. And she's also the first person to coin the phrase culturally responsive pedagogy or culturally responsive teaching. And the reason why I like the teachings and everything that I've learned through studying Dr. Ladson Billings is because, if you haven't figured it out yet, education is my vocation. So a lot of the work that I do with my teacher candidates and a lot of research that I engage in is grounded in culture. We attack a lot of the concepts about pedagogy, about teaching and learning, about working with children and families around culture. And with Dr. Ladson Billings, specifically tonight's discussion is related to her work in doing a critical examination of the poverty of culture. And the reason I'm focusing on the poverty of culture is because in her research, Dr. Ladson Billings refutes this concept of the culture of the culture of poverty. Let me repeat that. Her work centers around the poverty of culture, which refutes the concept of the culture of poverty. And the culture of poverty is this deficit view of culture where we speak about culture from the perspective of otherness. So what Dr. Ladson Billings argues is that it is our lack of understanding of this word culture, of what culture really is, that is actually the problem. Our lack of understanding of culture is the issue. And I want to draw your attention to the quote at the bottom of this slide. In her research with her own teacher candidates, and similar to me, the majority of the candidates that she worked with were white women, because we know historically education is overpopulated by white women. Over 80% of the teaching force are white women. And what she noticed in her research is that whenever her teacher candidates were in the classroom and they had struggles with children who did not look like them, and they could not figure out why their students weren't achieving or why they were facing different behavioral challenges in the classroom, and they just couldn't figure out how to address these. What Dr. Ladson Billings discovered was there's always this otherness to culture. So when they can't identify or explain what is happening in their classroom environments, the teacher candidates more often than not pointed to culture. And this is one of the things that I have noticed as well within my own teacher candidates. Like I said, when we talk about culture, I ask the same question to my candidates in the classroom environment. What is culture, and culturally how I identify? And one student raised her hand and she said, well, I don't have a culture. And I'll ask her, well, what do you mean? She said, well, I'm a white woman. And so that speaks to this need to conflate race with culture. And that's not to say that our racial identity doesn't inform our understanding of culture and how we engage in cultural practices. However, race and culture are not synonymous. So that's one of the challenges that Dr. Ladson Billings talks about when she's talking about the poverty of culture. We don't understand what we mean when we say culture. And so we use that word in the education field a lot of times to explain away things that we don't understand. Now, the reason why I share this with you is because I want to push you. Um, I want to expand your thinking beyond education. Because as Daryl stated at the beginning of this presentation, the work that we do in the Social Justice Coalition is more than just focused on the relationships and the interconnectedness of people within the Muskingum County community around race and education, but it's around other systems as well, the social justice system, the healthcare system. So I start here with this quote from Dr. Ladson Billings, because regardless of whether we're talking about education or the criminal justice system or the healthcare system, at the end of the day, what we tend to find is what we don't know, can't identify, explain, or understand, we typically other it and explain it from the point of view of culture. So with that said, let's dive into the meat of our discussion for this evening. Culture is a paradox, or the paradoxical nature of culture. One thing we need to understand is that all cultures have opposing views, and that's what makes culture paradoxical. When we think of that word paradox, we know that essentially it means a contradiction. So we're understanding it from one perspective. We have different elements that in isolation, they make perfectly good sense. They're very logical elements in isolation. However, when we consider all of these elements together, it tends to be illogical or uh, absurd. And we're like, well, how could both things be true at the same time? Like a lot of times I call the way I go about life and engage in different spaces and do things as organized chaos. Like, Allison, how can you be organized and chaotic at the same time? But the way I deal with work and my personal life and everything is organized chaos, and it works for me. Well, culture is the same way. Culture is also paradoxical. As I said, there are opposing values within culture. So culture can be unifying and segregating. And when I talk about culture being unifying and segregating, I want us to think about it from the perspective of American culture. Because for the most part, and I'm making somewhat of an assumption here because I don't know everyone on the call. But for the most part, we all identify as Americans who are a part of the American culture. And I think about American culture specifically when I travel overseas or to different countries, how you will meet someone else from the United States. So that's really unifying. Or you think about the Olympics. We're all cheering for the United States national team to win. We unified around this commonness of us all being American. Despite that, American culture is also segregated. This is one of our most segregated times since the civil rights movement. Just think, you don't even have to think that far back. Just reflect on January the 6th when the insurrectionists attacked the Capitol and all these different viewpoints. Those people that we saw on the news who were trying to get into the Capitol building and do harm also identify as American. But their viewpoint or their thinking of what is American culture was different or opposed what some of us feel is American culture. So culture is unifying and segregating when we think of it from a paradoxical perspective. It's also conscious and unconscious. Go back to the opening question of how do you define culture? I do this a lot with my teacher candidates. You know, I ask them to define something, or I'll say, "Do you know what this particular word means?" And 100% of the time, they say, "Yeah, of course, we know what that means." And I'll say, "Well, define it." And they sit there looking at me like deers in headlights. Well, that's how culture is, or even thinking about culture is conscious and it's unconscious. So unconsciously, um, you know what culture is. You tell yourself all the time, I know what culture is, and I know how I identify culturally if someone were to ask me. But consciously, when I asked you at the beginning, you don't have to raise your hand, you don't have to put it in the chat, you don't have to call out. But you probably took a pause and said, wait a minute, what is culture? How do I identify culturally? So consciously, you may have had a struggle in identifying or defining your own culture. So therein lies another paradox. Our cultures are conscious as well as unconscious, stable, predictable, and ever changing. Um, that goes back to the Margaret Mead definition that we encountered a few slides back. Um, think about American culture again. It is absolutely predictable when we think about American culture. I'll give you an example. We're often telling our children that you can be anything that you want to be, anything that you imagine, anything in the world, you can be that. Um, However, culturally in America, when we think about who I shouldn't say ascend, who is elected president in this country are typically who? White men who are, or white adjacent men who are rich and well connected. If you culturally don't fall into one of those categories, then the idea of being elected president of the United States is not as attainable as you thought it would be. However, it's also ever changing because prior to the election of President Obama, we had never had anyone who was anything other than a white man hold the office of president in this country. And who's to say in subsequent generations, you'll find someone who identifies with both of their parents being um, Black, or both of their parents being Latinx or Caribbean descent, being elected president of the United States and being a woman. So culture is ever changing. So the way that we look at American culture now, it's our presidents are white men or white adjacent men. And then the last paradox is stereotypical and individualistic. I like to look at this one more as individualism versus collectivism. Again, when we think about how we engage as a culture, we all have this need to belong. That is the collectivism of culture or of our nature as human beings. We all have this need to belong. But even as a whole culture and this need of wanting to belong, there is an individualistic component of our culture. No one, even those who identify as being a part of the American culture or Caribbean culture or Southern culture or Appalachian culture, even within those cultures, there are individualistic characteristics that allow people to culturally identify, although as a whole, they are a part of that culture. So culture is also individualistic and it is stereotypical. So, yeah, culture is a paradox. It is very contradictory. And sometimes it's hard for us to wrap our heads around what culture is and what that means to us. So now that we've done a quick overview of what culture is and how it presents as a paradox, the teacher in me wants to now give you time to process this information. What I know from my own experience is when we're in large groups, we're a little hesitant about sharing out our thoughts or what we think about different concepts that we're speaking about. So for the next 5 minutes, we're going to go into breakout rooms. People tend to be more forthcoming and able to share more when they're in smaller groups. So we're going to put you in smaller groups. And in these small groups, I want you to discuss two questions. Why do we attempt to silence some cultures while amplifying others under the guise of we are all one culture? And where and how did my understanding about my culture and those of different cultures manifest? And what is the possible impact of these biases on my relationships? So we're going to put you in breakout rooms about 5 minutes. And if you need to, please feel free to take a picture of this slide because I don't think my screen is going to share with you anymore once you get into your breakout room. But I want you to be able to process the information. Think about how you define culture, how you culturally identify. And then think about some of these definitions from both Margaret Mead and Dr. Jackson. And then lastly, think about how you're processing this information of culture in and of itself being a paradox as you're discussing these two questions in your breakout room. And then we're going to come back together and take a couple of minutes just to share out how we process this information and how we're beginning to think about it. All right? So join your breakout rooms and I'll see you all back here in about 5 minutes. Let's just take a few minutes. You all had an opportunity to process the information and, share out your thinking. So let's just take a few minutes to, if you want to, share out some of the thoughts and conversation that you had in your breakout room around these two questions. And anyone can feel free to jump in and start the conversation.
Well, if I may, we had a good discussion, and I know Amy may review some of our points, but I'd really like to give Kathleen the opportunity to finish. She was just starting to engage and make a point. So if we could do that, that would be great.
Okay.
You have to unmute yourself, Kathleen.
I'm always worried about background noises, so I keep pushing the mute button. I think when people have not been heard and then they take to the streets or they protest or they object or they say, let's hurry up and get some change here, then there are people who think they ought to just get back in line and not make waves and not say anything because it makes me uncomfortable, and as if it's going to change by ignoring it, which it doesn't change when you ignore it. So nothing ever changes. This is why it keeps going and going the way it is, I think, because the people who need to be listened to can't get listened to. And when they say you need to listen to us, it's like, well, you're being rude about it. And I think then, there's 100 ways to shut people up. And we can do it with fire hoses, or we can do it with, marginalization. We can do it a lot of ways, but I think we do it anyway.
If I could speak for group 2, we came at it from a couple of different perspectives. There was the individual and the group perspective. Individually, we know our own culture very well, and we get, maybe frustrated or, not even acknowledge that our culture is actually a culture, and that, when we encounter people that are not of our culture, it's kind of a surprise. And we see that, in people from other cultures, whether they're from other countries or a different segment of our own locality that you know, they would make some assumptions about us based on the stereotypes that that they've perceived. So, you know, there's a degree of maybe friction or frustration, or, you know, I'm not sure what the right word is, on an individual level when those sort of cultural clashes happen. But there's also a point of the collective where, you know, there's a temptation of a group of people of a similar culture to, you know, want or suppress you know, cultures that we're not familiar with, you know, assuming that, well, ours is the right, you know, right culture, and you know, want everybody to sort of conform to that. So there's always this sort of push pull, you know, based on just naivete, I guess, that there are, you know, benefits culturally to you know, differences. So I'll conclude with that.
Thank you, Kathleen and Tom.
Susan,
Anyone
did that
else?
cover your collective thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think maybe it kind of underestimates how malignant that can be. But yeah, generally, I think you captured it.
This is Jim. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I've been struggling with, first of all, with the setup and then the sound and so forth. That's first Zoom session I've ever been on, so I've struggled a little bit technology-wise. But one thing I'm dying to throw in here is, to me, culture is not, it sounds like a simple term, but it is extremely complicated. I mean, aren't we all driven by certain aspects of our culture, whether it be race, financial status, politics, religion? And even if you're trying to interact with somebody from another culture and trying to understand, you know, you two may be coming at each other from different priorities, perspectives, and biases that makes it terribly difficult, I think, sometimes to understand somebody else. To me, culture is not a very simple term. I mean, I can remember 50 years ago, by one of my college classes, we were talking about politics. To this day, I still remember, you are certainly politically driven by who you were, where you were, when. And it's just, I mean, that sort of course, thing is subject to change over the years, but it's basically, we're influenced different ways in our culture, and then we prioritize, whether we know it or not, by things that are more important in our lives than we may even think, or anybody else that we're trying to relate to.
Great point. I absolutely agree. It is a very complicated concept.
Yeah.
In our group, we pointed out the fact that, well, for the first question, that sometimes we see this as a defense mechanism. You know, this kind of, you know, well, we're all the same, you know, this type of thing, because people might be afraid to admit that they don't know everything, basically. That especially that they don't have the insight of, say, the lived experience of someone else. And so it's easy to gloss over rather than to admit, you know, some deficiency in your knowledge because you don't have that experience. And we also lamented a fact that this could manifest in our relationships. And we talked about in education where, say, youth often segregate into different lunch tables. And you know, that we self-segregate quite often to those that we feel more culturally comfortable with, rather than actually going out and finding and learning and exchanging and getting some of those ideas of the lived experiences that we lack as another type of defense mechanism.
Yeah, you definitely hit the nail on the head, Amy, and whew, that could start a whole nother hour and a half, 2-hour conversation with everything that you just shared. Thank you, everyone. for sharing your thoughts on these two questions. It sounds like you really did dive into your groups and process the information and really had some strong thoughts about this thing, this construct of culture. So thank you all for sharing. So as we're coming to the end of today's presentation, let's go back to what we started with, which is, what is culture? And culturally, how do we identify? So we need to understand that culture is everywhere. And no two cultures are the same, which is what many of you just got finished sharing as you recap what you discussed in your breakout rooms. Our cultures shape our decisions that we make in life. And culture is often a source of conflict and disagreement when we are engaging with each other. So when you think about how you conceptualize this word and came up with your own definitions, I'm wondering, or I shouldn't have to wonder, I looked at the Jamboard, some of you talked about race being a part of how you culturally identify. But also understanding that ability is crucial to culture in some circles. Gender identification is a part of our culture. Regionally, our location, where we're from, plays a huge part in how we culturally identify. And our socioeconomic status also informs our culture and how we identify culturally. So one thing I want you to remember, and I'm going to say it louder for the people in the back, no culture is a monolith. We can be from the same places and engage in the same spaces and have similar backgrounds, but thinking about that individualism versus collectivism. When you've met one person from a particular culture, you just met one person from that culture. There are different intricacies within cultures that we need to be considerate of. And as we work on keeping this conversation going and keeping our thinking moving, we need to think about, how do we move forward and have purposeful communications and build authentic relationships despite our cultural differences? So that's the question I want to leave you with in closing today's conversation. And I thank you all for your attention and your engagement. And I hope that you did learn something and have something that you can take away and share with others.
Thank you, Dr. Gunter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Gunter.
Excellent discussion. I appreciate everyone participating in the breakouts and also in the discussion. So I have a couple of things to share before we close, but I just want to make sure we have time and space. If anyone else has any other comments or thoughts on the presentation, now's the time. Okay, I don't see anything. There's a couple of things in the chat. I want to make sure we see those. Okay. So just a couple of things before we sign out for the evening. Again, I appreciate all of you being here. I appreciate Dr. Gunter offering that presentation. I really encourage you to do a couple things leaving this evening. One is to think about some of the things that were presented. I know one thing that I will definitely keep in mind and think about is to make sure that we don't conflate culture and race. They're two different constructs. And also just the idea that that it really is a paradox. I love the simple example that you gave about how we root for Olympians, because they're from America, but certainly there are other things that go on where people are very divided on the appropriateness of it and those kind of things. So I really appreciated that. But I would ask you to think about, I mentioned at the beginning of today's session that this was the third educational sessions in our series, with the first one being when Dr. Jackson talked to us about what is culture, and the second one being about cultural relativism with Dr. White, and today about cultural paradoxes. To me, the connection is perfect. So I would ask you to, if you go back and look at the materials that were offered from all three of these presentations, and encourage your friends, peers, colleagues, whoever, to go back and look at the recorded sessions and look at the information. I think our presenters have tied those things together extremely well. And I really encourage you to think deeply about that, and to, again, share it with your friends and colleagues and other people that may be interested or curious. You know, one of the things that we talked about was sometimes we're curious right up to the point until we're uncomfortable, and then we back away from our curiosity. So if you know folks who are curious, encourage them to get a little bit past that discomfort. You know, it's a recorded session. Nobody's going to challenge them. Nobody's going to, you know, embarrass them or insult them or anything like that. So encourage them to participate, even though it's after the fact. I think they will take something away from that. The last couple of things I want to remind you of is that our next session, June 17th, and the topic will be how we got here, right? The emergence of racism. So we're going to start to kind of dig into some things a little bit. I think we've had, again, a good foundation about culture and all things surrounding it. So we're going to start to get into some of the meatier conversations, if you will, that are underneath that. So I hope that you can be here for that, join us for that. And please check our Facebook for activities that we are engaged in, information that we have to share, things that we are supporting in the community. And our meetings are the first and third Tuesday of each month at 6 p.m. If you don't have the information already, contact Heather, and she'd be happy to make sure that you are invited to our meetings to hear the things that we're talking about and the direction that we are headed as a coalition. So we're not just only doing this series, we're starting to take a dive into some other concrete issues in our community that we feel is appropriate for us to confront and to look at and move towards some change in our community. So I see Tom just put our Facebook link in the chat, so I appreciate that. So click on that if you would. Make sure you check us out. And I think that is all we have for this evening. Again, I appreciate your time and your attention. Thank you very much. Everyone have a good night, and we'll see you soon.